This is great news, and we applaud this decision. But in many other countries in Africa, gay men and other men who have sex with men are increasingly the target of a campaign of hate and have been arrested, detained, and sentenced. Ralph Talk dedicated his remarks to one of the gay men he met in Senegal. I remember meeting with some of those support groups to gay men in Senegal, again at night, hiding in the periphery of Dakar city. This is not only unacceptable under international human rights law, but also harmful from the point of view of public health. It drives these men underground and away from the services they need. So I call with you on legislators to change outdated penal codes that contain prohibitions against same-sexual activity. Another area in which progress lags far behind, with disastrous consequences, including fueling the HIV epidemic throughout Africa, is human rights of women and girls. In too many countries, women and girls continue to be subject to violence, denied sexual and reproductive health services, property and inheritance rights, and the basic means to protect themselves from HIV. This must change, and I'm committed to ensuring that the Global Fund will be part of the solution. People who use illegal drugs. Jonathan will recognize this slide from OSI. People who use illegal drugs also continue to suffer widespread human rights abuses. They continue being denied harm reduction services, have poor and inequitable access to antiretroviral therapy, suffer abuse and sometimes torture at the hand of law enforcement officials, and are often incarcerated simply for using or possessing drugs. And these abuses are not only reported from St. Petersburg, where my friend Sasha and his colleagues are engaged in a daily fight for health and human rights. They are reported in all regions of the world. They are abhorrent in themselves, and we must fight them for this reason alone. They also increase people's vulnerability to HIV and negatively affect the delivery of HIV programs. Much more needs to happen to fight these abuses. One of the priorities is to stop wasting resources on the failed so-called war against drugs that has turned into a war against people who use drugs. And this has been highlighted in many reports, and also in a series of the deadly war on drugs in Mexico that was just recently published by the Toronto Star. The resources that are currently being wasted should instead be devoted to providing to everyone who needs them evidence-based and human rights-based interventions that prevent problematic drug use, treat drug dependence, and ensure harm reduction services for people who use drugs. In the 2 years since the last International AIDS Conference, several reports have drawn attention to the fact that in a number of countries, people who use drugs are detained without due process in compulsory drug detention centers. In these centers, they face what is called treatment or rehabilitation, quote rehabilitation, but reality, this is coercion, forced labor, human rights abuse, including torture. In many of these centers, the services provided do not accord with either human rights or evidence, and not surprisingly, relapse rates are extremely high. It has recently been drawn to my attention that some Global Fund grants finance services in a number of these centers. I have asked that we undertake an initial analysis of our grant portfolio, which indicates that our grants support a range of HIV prevention and treatment services, as well as some training in providing such services in some of these centers. And providing such services in such centers where serious human rights violations occur clearly poses ethical dilemmas. All compulsory drug detention centers should be closed and replaced by drug treatment facilities that work and that conform to ethical standards and human rights norms. At the same time, I strongly believe that detainees should be provided with access to effective prevention and treatment, provided in a manner respectful of their rights and dignity. So let me take here the opportunity to thank the civil society organizations for their strong advocacy and for bringing the serious human rights abuses in these centers to the world's attention. The issues raised by compulsory drug detention centers speak to what you, Joanne, had called the heart, quote, the heart of the Global Fund's human rights dilemma, espousing human rights principle while also being committed to allowing HIV responses to be driven by countries. Indeed, the Fund is firmly committed to both, to human rights-based programming and to the principle that responses must be driven and owned by countries rather than imposed by donors. Admittedly, our dual commitment to human rights and to country ownership sometimes pose challenges, particularly when countries fail to implement rights-based policies and programs or have written policies that undermine human rights. But one thing is clear, we do not support interventions that are not evidence-based or that infringe human rights. The lack of support for programs that protect and promote human rights is one of the failures in the response to AIDS. Rights-based programming puts the needs of women and of the most marginalized population at the center. It addresses not only their most immediate health needs, but recognizes, for example, that providing legal assistance may be as important to a person who injects drugs as a needle or as a condom. The Global Fund actively encourages rights-based programming, including through our gender equality strategy and our sexual orientation and gender identity strategy. Similarly, we have recently adopted an initiative to increase access to prevention and treatment for people who inject drugs, including in prisons and pre-trial detention settings. We hope this initiative will contribute to vastly increase access to services for people who inject drugs. So let us use all together the upcoming International AIDS Conference in Vienna to reinvigorate the AIDS movement as a human rights movement, as the conference in Durban did 10 years ago. In placing the right to treatment on the global agenda, we need a new, strong and united call for human rights and for continued, ambitious scale-up of treatment and prevention now more than ever. I was honored to receive an invitation to speak at the March for Human Rights in Vienna. I hope all of you who will be in Vienna will participate in the march. The conference and the march in particular are a great opportunity to unite everyone involved in the fight against AIDS at a defining moment in the history of the response. They will provide us with an opportunity to clearly articulate why it would be a human rights and public health disaster to turn our backs on millions of people in need. So let us ensure we use Vienna to reinvigorate our movement, a movement for health and justice that must continue to grow and become more vocal again. And finally, the fourth priority and challenge that was mentioned by David in his remarks. We need a robust, ambitious replenishment for the Global Fund. Without it, we will not be able to move resolutely forward at the speed required on any of the other three priorities I just mentioned. Since its inception, the Global Fund has now become the main multilateral contributor to achievement of the health-related Millennium Development Goals. Let me switch back to French for a few moments.